Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to the shading tutorial. So today we're going to be shading up the hand tattoo that we outlined yesterday. And before we get into this, so there's a couple of things that really help to know about shading before you start, right? So we're just going to turn the sheet over and we're going to do a couple of little warm-up exercises before we start shading. And you'll see that I've already done a couple here, but it's like basically just like these little balls and I've flicked it out. So that's all black. There's no lighter gradients or anything like that on this sheet. And what I'm doing basically is just practicing going from dark to light and just getting my transitions right. You want to be kind of warmed up before you start doing, at least in the beginning. When you're tattooing a client, you don't exactly have that opportunity, but yeah, when you're just working on practice skin, you have that opportunity to kind of warm up. So it helps to do a couple of these little exercises before you start, right? So there's two kind of main techniques with shading. There's whip shading and then there's pendulum shading, brush shading. People call it different things, right? Most of the time, I pretty much do every black and gray tattoo I do with whip shading and a little bit of pendulum shading, but I do it a little bit differently. It's kind of how most people do it and it just works for me, all right? But before you even get to that, when you're doing black and gray, highly recommend using 10 gauge needles. So needles come in 8, 10, and 12 gauge. 12 gauge are like the standard needles. They're great for color because the needles are thicker. They pack more ink into the skin. 10 gauge needles, on the other hand, are thinner. And because they're thinner, the sharps on the needle are smaller and they put smaller holes in the skin, which means it's much easier to get these feathery transitions and blend stuff out with black and gray. Wouldn't recommend using these for color because it'll massively increase the amount of time it will take to make solid fills, but they're great for black and gray. Also as well, using curved mags. When you're doing black and gray, always recommend using a curved mag just because you'll be able to get these softer edges much easier, and especially when you shade with the corners, you'll get like a dark edge on kind of one side and then you'll get like a feathery kind of edge out the other side, which is really great. It saves you a lot of time. And pretty much without even doing any whip shading or anything, you can set up a transition for your next shade without having to blend it out, which saves you a lot of time. So I'll just run over you through how I do whip shading and pendulum shading. So right now I'm using a 3-stroke on my machine. Always recommend using a really a shorter stroke for black and gray because the machine will have less power and a softer hit, which means it's going to be easy to get those nice smooth transitions. If you use a 4mm stroke, or the same thing that you use for a liner, it's going to have too much power and you're going to find it really difficult to get nice smooth shades. All right, so coming up first, we'll just show you a little bit of whip shading. So make sure you got a little bit of Vaseline on the skin. I'm running my machine at 8 volts, nice and slow. And when it comes to depth, you don't want to have it so deep that the machine kind of grinds every time you do some whip shading, but you don't want to have it so shallow that as soon as you put the cartridge down, it just dumps ink everywhere. You want to find that nice, happy medium. And for me, that is kind of like that. It's pretty shallow. I could go a little bit deeper, but again, you'll find that you'll probably overwork the skin a bit once you go start doing some whip shading, especially if you don't have a tension bar on your machine, like we do on the injector, because that kind of allows the machine to back off a bit. Direct drive, you really got to be careful with the depth control because if you have your needle set too deep, it'll just grind into the skin and it'll hack them up, right? So here is some whip shading. What I do is I'll put the needles in the skin and then I'll arc out. It's a nice arcing kind of motion. You can arc back in and then that will put ink into the skin faster and it'll build up your layers quicker. But I tend to like to kind of just flick it out once because I find it allows me to kind of sculpt the shading a bit more. The faster you move your hands as well, the further apart the dots will be. So the more you'll get that kind of nice fade out when you kind of move your hands a bit faster. Another thing that you want to do as well is crosshatch, right? So all the needles, if you flick out your needles in the same direction all the time, there's going to be gaps because the needles are hitting the same place every time it goes up and down. Whereas if you flick out a bunch of shading going like this, and then you change directions, and then you go like that, you're gonna naturally fill in all those little gaps that are left by the needles going up and down every time it moves across the skin. So you're gonna get more even transitions if you cross shade. Also your depth as well, how much you push the needles into the skin will determine how dark the dots are. The cool thing about black is it's the easiest color to get in the skin, and even if you go a bit shallow, it'll still stay there when it heals within reason. If you're just literally, you know, like brushing the skin like that, then when it heals, it will lighten up a lot and you'll lose some of that. But you can, you know, kind of back off a little bit and it will put lighter gradients into the skin. And then again, yeah, I'm just arcing out, spreading that shade. It is tempting to constantly change the direction of the skin and move it around. That will make it a lot easier to whip your shades out, but it will make you develop a bad habit for when you start tattooing actual people, because you can't just flip people around. So you kind of want to get used to shading out from multiple different angles. And when you can do that, it'll translate a lot better to when you start tattooing skin. Cool, so that's whip shading. And the next one is brush shading, right? So brush shading or pendulum shading is when you kind of go back and forth like that. And then as the skin hits in the middle, as the needle hits in the middle of the movement, that's where it will be the darkest. So that's how you get shading without any kind of edges on it, right? Sometimes you won't always have like a line to whip the shading up from. And you'll need to create kind of just gradients from nothing, right? I kind of don't do that as much. What I normally do is I'll sort of, if it's like a really light flat gradient that I've got to get, I'll just pack a lighter shade and then I'll whip that out. I do sometimes use brush shading, but what I'll do is I'll just go in kind of very lightly and I'll move it back and forth, and I'll use a combination of pendulum shading and the oval formation that I use when I'm packing, and I'll just even out my shades by going kind of very lightly over the part that I'm working on. But yeah, just to demonstrate sort of the brush motion. It's really important when you do that as well that you want to cross hatch, right? So as you're kind of doing your brush strokes, you want to change directions or come from a different angle. Right now I'm kind of using like that really light packing kind of motion to even stuff out. Yeah, like I said, I mainly use a combination of packing and whipping to do my gradients. I don't really like the pendulum shading technique. A lot of people use it, but you know, I kind of do it my own way with just a combination of the really light packing, and then I'll whip out off of that, and then that's gives me kind of like these nice smooth sort of fade outs that you see here, and then that's how I shade black and grey. Just pretty much use a combination of those two techniques. I do a lot of shading from the corners as well. It's really cool when you build up like a solid. When you shade with the corner of a curve maker, you get one solid edge, like really sharp, and then as on towards the other side of the mag, it'll naturally fade out without you even having to kind of whip it out. So those are pretty much the techniques that I use for black and grey. It's really quite simple. It is a little bit different when you do stippling, but we'll get into that's kind of a tutorial for another day. But yeah, you can use the the pendulum shading to just move back and forth, and then as you keep cross hatching, the center will get sort of darker. But you know, if you find that technique doesn't work for you, you can kind of shade pretty much any tattoo with a combination of packing and whip shading. So we're going to put that into practice. We're going to tattoo this hand that we outlined yesterday, and I'll just show you all those techniques as I explained them before. Just put a nice layer of Vaseline over the entire tattoo before we start. Again, I'm just when I get really light areas, I'm literally just very lightly brushing the needles against the skin, just to smooth it out, so that when I put the next gradient over it, it's a nice and smooth blend. But yeah, the way that I do brush shading is like, I'll just very lightly, like I'll use the corner of the mag, and I'll go, that's when I go in like normal depth, and that'll get me my solid black. And then in order to blend that out, I decrease my depth, and I'm just lightly brushing the top of the skin, and then that's how I get those lighter fades with the black. Allows me to get those nice, smooth blends. you want to get to a point where the shading, sorry, the black is so smoothly whipped out, you kind of almost don't even need the lighter shades to blend off of it. When you get to that point, you're crushing it. You're doing really well. A lot of time as well, I like using really big mags in tattoos, just because I like to use the biggest mag that the tattoo will allow, just because it's easier to get smoother shades with a large mag than it is with a small one. And traditional pieces like this, with there's not a ton of detail, you can get away with using a really big mag. Obviously, like when you start doing realism and hyper detailed stuff, you will need to use a smaller mag. And that's okay. But when you get the opportunity, there's like lots of, areas of like flat color and there's just massive blends, the bigger the mag you use, the easier it will be to to get consistent blends. Plus, you'll tattoo faster because you cover more ground. So again, this is just lightly brushing across the top of the skin. Just whipping this out now, changing the position of the mag so I get that nice cross-hatching effect. And again, yeah, my hand movements are kind of like a hybrid between pendulum shading and whip shading. I sort of do them both, and I also, like right now, I'm just like really lightly packing, but I'm going super shallow, so it's not putting a ton of black in, but it smooths out the transitions. A really easy way to tell, like sometimes, if you haven't got a ton of drawing experience, you might be unsure of what part to shade the tattoo. Typically the stuff that's further away from your eye, like for example, this hand is in front of the arrow. So typically that will be darker because the arrow will be darker just because it's behind the hand. It's not always like the rule, but it's a good place to start. If you're completely brand new and you're not sure like on where you're supposed to be putting your shades, it's a good place to start. Again, just using the corner here, I'm sort of packing with the corner, and because one edge of the mag is further into the skin than the other, I'm getting a nice solid fill on one side, and that's blending it out for me on the other side. Now I'm just kind of doing like a bit of pendulum shading, but really lightly. Now the reason why I'm putting black in almost everywhere is that black is the color that ages the best. So I could just put a lighter shade in these part of the fingers because it's not fully black, but the reason why I like just lightly touching black in there instead, I'll put a lighter shade over that later on as well, but the more black you have in a tattoo, the longer it's gonna last. So even if it's lightly packed in like this, you want to put in as much of it as you can. Obviously you don't want to make the tattoo too dark, but the tattoo should almost look finished when you've just done your blacks and everything's kind of smoothed out, right? And then the lighter shades are just kind of smoothing everything out, making things a bit more kind of solid. Again, you see, like, even though like I'm using black, it's not super dark because I haven't gone in very heavy. I've just lightly put it in, so I'm still able to get those lighter shades without, while still just using black, which is going to age the best, right? And then because I'm using the 10 gauge needles, whenever I whip it out, I get a smooth transition because I'm able to get those finer little holes in the skin. Again, just very lightly brushing the needles against the skin to get these ultra light tones with straight black. I'm still just using black. I haven't changed my tones or anything like that. So this is where my black is, just here. Then I've got my 1 wash, my 2 wash, my 3 wash. And then, yeah, when I want to start using lighter tones, I will grab those. But just want to make sure that all my blacks are put in first, and I'll work my way up to kind of my lightest tones a bit later on. The good thing is when you go very light onto the skin as well, it doesn't cause a bunch of trauma to the skin, so you're able to layer it quite a fair bit. I'm going to be putting the lighter tones straight over these blacks that I'm putting in really light just to smooth them out. It's going to come up real nice. And if you want these designs too, just to follow along while you're tattooing, there'll be a link in the description just below this video. You can grab them as well. You want to make sure as well that you don't sort of leave gaps near where the corners and the lines are, because that can, yeah, you leave too many of them, it just makes the piece not look super clean. So you want to come right up to the edges, making sure that you're not kind of missing any bits. One of the ways you do that as well is you want to judge where the ink's going to go by looking at the needle, not the cartridge, because otherwise you'll always have like a slight gap between where you're shading and where the edge of the line is. What we can also do as well is if we just use the corners here of the mag, just put a nice heavy bit of black just around the palm. So this is, yeah, just me whip shading again. Very lightly, just going across the skin, cross hatching to smooth it out. But also going really light, just because I only want a very subtle tone in the skin. what I'm going to do as well is just to clean up this little bit here, make sure that's nice and clean, is I'm just going to grab a 3 liner and I'm just going to sharpen up that edge just a tad so that it's nice and flush with the line. Cool, so that's cleaned it up real nice. Now we're going to put our lighter shades in to kind of smooth everything out. You can skip tones as well. You don't always have to work your way kind of down the tones that you've got. You can go from like black to a 3, sorry, black to a 3 wash or 2 wash. You don't always just have to go 1, 2, 3. What you can also do as well is I've just got like my dipping water here. And once that gets like a little bit of black in it, you can use that as an even lighter wash because that's got the amount of water that's got in there in comparison to like the in caps. It's super light, so you can even just use that to shade as well. But it'll be super faded, it'll be super transparent. So yeah, it's not going to be super dark. Also as well, keep in mind that grey wash, when it's on skin, it will look about 30% darker than what it actually is because the blood mixes with the ink and it makes it look darker. So when it heals, grey wash will typically lighten up by like 20 to 30%. So you kind of want it to put it like a little bit, sort of a tad bit darker than what you think it should look. So that way when it heals and it lightens up, yeah, it's kind of goes to like the perfect sort of shades. But yeah, a lot of, especially a lot of realism tattoo artists that make this mistake, or they get it to look perfect when it's fresh, but then once it heals, you know, it just doesn't, it fades a lot, and then it doesn't have the same contrast that it had when it was fresh. So something to keep in mind. especially for traditional pieces like this. You shouldn't have to put in like a ton of solid gradients of like the lighter colors. You're kind of just smoothing out your blacks. Some traditional artists will just whip them out and leave it at that, but I like to do them ultra smooth because it just looks, I find it just looks a bit cleaner. And it stands out a bit because, you know, every trad tattooer, every trad tattooer just whips their blacks out and it kind of looks all the same. So when you can make them look a little bit different, it'll definitely set you apart, which is good. Again, so when I'm putting in these lighter shades, I'm using kind of like a packing motion where I'm sort of doing my ovals combined with like a whip shading. And just constantly angling my mags to make sure that I'm hitting all of these small gaps. Whenever you want to change shades as well, it's best to dip your needles, reset the tone, and then dip into the tone that you want. Just because if you go from like a black to a 3-wash, and there'll still be some black left in the cartridge, and it'll massively kind of darken it, and it won't be that super light tone that you want. So you can see that I'm layering these lighter washes over the black just to smooth them out. Sometimes you will, instead of resetting your wash always, you will just go straight into a lighter color when you kind of run out of ink. And when you're shading, like if it just gets to a point where there's nothing left in the cartridge, you can just go to a lighter shade. But if there's still like a little bit of ink left in the cartridge and there's nothing left to shade and you want to change tones, then yeah, you definitely want to rinse it out. Just doing some brush shading here, again using one edge of the mag so that one side is solid and the other side is nice and feathered out. It helps to be a bit loose with black and grey as well. You don't want to be too super tight. You don't have to have like that 3 points of contact thing that you do like with lining, because you want to be just a bit looser so you can get sort of smoother blends. But still, you know, take your time. You don't want to go too fast, because then what will happen is spots will get missed and it'll just kind of, it won't have that nice clean look that you want it to have. Just basically doing oval shading now, just very lightly into the skin. It's the exact same kind of motion I'd use for packing. It's probably a little bit more slower and more controlled, but yeah, the lighter the washes are, the kind of the looser you can sort of be with it. Just doing really wide ovals now. What you'll kind of find is when it gets to the really light shades, a lot of the time you don't even have to whip it out. You can kind of just do ovals, like the same kind of motion that you would do for packing, just a bit faster and a bit looser, and you'll still get like those nice fades. It's just kind of like a combination of pendulum shading and packing. So just moving my needles, very tight packing motions at the moment, leaning more towards one corner to get me a solid edge on one side. so that I can have a soft feathery edge on the other side. One thing to keep in mind, guys, as well, when you are doing black and grey shading on fake skin, your tones will look a bit darker than what they do on actual people. So you can get kind of used to tattooing a bit too light on fake skin. So yeah, on actual skin, your tones will look a bit lighter. Cool, so that's the shading done for the hand. Yeah, so big things to remember when you are shading. So I use a combination of like packing and whip shading. Sometimes I'll be like packing, but I'll also be like whipping it out. And when it comes to pendulum shading, I kind of do it, but I brush very lightly on top of the shades just to even. I use that as like a technique for evening out the tones. So yeah, I don't use pendulum shading a whole lot. It's mostly just kind of packing and whipping. And then once you get into these lighter shades, you can pretty much just use like a packing motion and be really loose. And then you'll put the tones down. You'll still get like the edges real nice and smooth. So also as well, just be careful of having your needles move side to side because they'll slice the skin up like a razor blade. You don't want that. And before you start doing some black and gray shading, it's good to do a couple little warm-ups like this. Just practice, whipping out your blacks and getting a nice, smooth, even transitions. And then you'll be good to go. So I hope that helps, guys. If you got any value out of this video at all, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. And by the way, if you are looking to become a professional tattoo artist, then you should definitely check out our Artist Accelerator program. Inside, we've broken down the entire process of learning how to tattoo down into 9 simple steps that literally anyone can follow. We've taught over 2,500 artists to tattoo since we started back in 2016. So if you want to learn from someone that's been there and done it and follow a proven process, highly recommend checking out the Artist Accelerator program. I'll leave a link down below and I'll see you there. Thanks guys, talk soon.